When working with web applications, Spring Boot embraces embedded servlet containers. The library chooses to bundle the servlet container within the application instead of deploying the application to a standalone container. In this lesson, we'll see how to switch between embedded servlet containers and how to customize their behavior. If we inspect the dependencies within our pom.xml file, you'll notice that we have included the Spring Boot Starter web, and looking further at the dependency hierarchy, you'll see that it has a transitive dependency on Spring Boot Starter Tomcat, and that is another starter POM. So by default, Spring Boot sets our web applications up to use Tomcat. Well, that may not be our preference, and we may need to switch that. So what we can do is right-click on that transitive dependency, and then click on Exclude Maven Artifact. And this is going to allow us to enter an exclusion into our pom.xml file. You'll want to keep the exclusion at that top layer for our project, so just hit OK. And now if we save our POM file, we can go inspect its source. And now you'll notice that within the Spring Boot Starter Web artifact, there has been an exclusion placed for the Spring Boot Starter Tomcat artifact, and it tells Maven not to pull down that library. So all we need to do now to switch over to another embedded servlet container is add a dependency on the starter POM. So we're going to look for org.springframework.boot, and this will display all of the starter POMs available to us. And let's go ahead and configure our application to use Jetty, which is another embedded servlet container. So if we go ahead and save that configuration, we can now relaunch our application. And now if we navigate to a browser, we can access our Timeleaf template. And you see that we are presented with our view. And if we look further in the logs, we're going to see that instead of Tomcat, we are now using Jetty. So here we see a Jetty embedded servlet container factory bean, and that is building out the Jetty container that is servicing all of our requests. Now, also with Spring Boot, we can provide a number of properties that customize the behavior of our embedded servlet containers. These properties are found within the server node, and if we take a look, some of the most common configurations you'll see are changes to how we connect to the server itself. So for example, we can specify the address property. The address property specifies the IP address or the host name that the Jetty connector is going to bind our server to. In our case, I'm going to go ahead and enter my machine name, which is Titan, so you're a little bit more familiar with my local machine. You can also specify the port, and this once again is going to modify that connector information within your embedded servlet container. And let's say we go on port 9090, and then you can modify the context path, which is going to be the root path of your application. And it always needs to start with a forward slash. So here we have set our application to run at Titan on port 9090, and the context path will be /app. So let's relaunch our application, and then we'll visit this URL. So I'm going to navigate over to the browser, and let's change things up here. So we need to replace localhost with Titan. We need to switch our port over to 9090, and then we need to navigate to /app/timeleaf. And we have modified the connector information successfully for our embedded Jetty servlet container. Returning back to our application.properties file, now we're going to take a look at how we can compress the responses that we provide back to the client. In order to enable compression, we use the server.compression property, and the first thing we need to do is enable it. And then we need to specify a size of the responses that we want to compress. So normally I believe this is set to 2048. So we would like to compress pretty much everything. So I'm going to set this to 0. So no matter what the size of our resource, we're going to compress it. Now, you'll also see within these properties a MIME type, and you can specify an array of MIME types that this applies to. Now, by default, Spring Boot is going to configure HTML, XML, plain text, and CSS. So these defaults are more than adequate for us, for our purposes, so we're not going to specify any additional resources there. But you can discern what Spring Boot will compress via the configuration for the embedded servlet container. So let's go ahead and we can restart our application. And then I'm going to navigate to the browser and we'll open up the developer tools within Chrome, and I'm just going to navigate to this URL. And here you see on our network traffic that we have our request. And if we look at the response headers, we do see that it is now gzip encoded. So here, this is the header we're looking for, and that's going to help us serve resources to the client more quickly and reduce the traffic that we are sending over our network. Finally, I'd just like to point out that Spring Boot has support for Tomcat, Jetty, and Undertow. And you'll actually see some more Tomcat specific properties within the application.properties file in the IntelliSense it provides. So you can further refine the configuration of these embedded servlet containers using Spring Boot.